Good afternoon, everyone. I am Antoine Colson, CEO of IPEM, and I would like to thank you all for attending this exclusive webcast today. This is indeed a deep pleasure and a real honor to have Sir Ronald Cohen with us today for a live conversation just a few days before the official release of his cornerstone book, Impact, Reshaping Capitalism to Drive Real Change. The title of this webcast is Impact Investing Sets the New Normal After COVID-19. This crisis is indeed a blunt wake-up call for all of us. The pandemic exposed how fragile and dysfunctional our economic system was. Inequalities are now reaching unsustainable levels. Globalization and democracy are being challenged from all sides. This outbreak has also accelerated tectonic shifts already well underway in society and the economy, such as digitalization, sustainable consumption, deglobalization. In finance, ESG was already top of mind for institutional investors. After the epidemic, impact investing may well become the new standard. So we are now more than 200 online, so please use the Q&A feature in your Teams screen. We will take your questions at the end of this webcast. Before joining Sir Cohen for the best inspiring discussion, which is always a great way to start the week, I would like to tell you a few words about him. Described by The Economist as the compassionate capitalist, Sir Ronald Cohen was born in Egypt in 1945, which he fled when he was 11 years old during the Suez Canal crisis. When he arrived in the UK with his family and his collection of Egyptian stamps gripped at his side, the young Ronald did not speak English. He would soon be top of the class and a brilliant student. He won a scholarship to Oxford University and earned a degree in philosophy, politics, and economics at Exeter College. He subsequently attended Harvard Business School, where he earned an MBA. After a brief stint with McKinsey, Ronald Cohen formed Apax Partners with friends in 1971, one of the first, if not the first, venture capital firm in Europe. Apax grew from scratch to investing more than 50 billion since its creation. Sir Cohen was also a founder of the British Venture Capital Association and of the European Venture Capital Association, now Invest Europe. We had to create the industry in Europe in order to build the firm, he once said to a journalist. He is now applying the same strategy with impact investing. It is hard not to be impressed by Ronald Cohen's lofty ideals, wrote The Guardian when he quit Apax in 2005. Sir Cohen took numerous initiatives to gospel impact investing since. It chaired the Social Impact Investment Task Force established under UK's presidency of the G8 from 2013 to 2015, the Social Investment Task Force from 2000 to 2010, and the Commission of Unclaimed Assets from 2005 to 2007. In 2002, Ronald Cohen co-founded Bridges Fund Management, one of Europe's leading impact investment firms, and Big Society Capital in 2011, the world's first social investment institution of its kind. In 2012, Ronald Cohen received the Rockefeller Foundation's Innovation Award for Innovation in Social Finance. Knighted in 2001, Sir Ronald Cohen is today chairman of the Global Steering Group for Impact Investment and the Portland Trust. Good afternoon, Sir Cohen.
Good afternoon to you, Antoine.
How are you?
I'm extremely well, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you and all our listeners on this, or viewers on this webinar.
That's a pleasure, much shared by me and by the IPM team as well. Before we jump into your book and the impact revolution, I may have a personal question, if you like.
Sure.
Can you please share with us your personal journey to impact? What personal experiences have you made? What were your experiences that made you the first apostle of impact and impact investing?
Of course. So I was happily running Apax and hoping to reduce the gap between rich and poor by backing entrepreneurs who came, for the most part, from very modest backgrounds, and becoming increasingly uncomfortable about the fact that as a venture capitalist, I was apparently increasing the gap between rich and poor rather than reducing it, when I got a phone call unexpectedly, sitting at my desk in London, from the UK Treasury. And this was early in 2000. And the call went something like this. Look, we've been looking at poverty and doing our best to reduce it. We don't seem to be making much progress. Would you please lead the task force to look at this issue with a more entrepreneurial eye? And Antoine, for the reasons I explained, I immediately said yes, I would be happy to do that, because I actually became a venture capitalist in order to help create jobs. I saw a social purpose as well as a financial purpose in it. And that first look at how our system tackles the issue of poverty and all the other social issues that arise from it really set me on the path to our conversation today. Because I realized then, and we published it in a report, that we have been extremely effective in inventing new ways of funding those who want to make money, like venture capital. But we haven't really we didn't then certainly have a system where those who want to improve the lives of others could access investment capital. And so we recommended then in 2000 in our report that we should create an investment bank, a social investment bank, to find a way of connecting social entrepreneurs and the capital markets. And that work led me to the social impact bond 10 years later, where we developed the first security whose return depended on the achievement of a social improvement. In this particular case, the reduction in the number of freed prisoners who went back to Peterborough jail in the UK. And then set me on the road of the G8 task force, where I realized that quite apart from being a very important new invention for not-for-profits to access investment capital, the social impact bond was really the first expression of the new world, the world of risk, return, and impact, rather than the world of risk return, which we've known for 250 years.
So this led you to have numerous initiatives and to write this book, Impact, which is being released this week, and which you probably see as your cornerstone opus, right? Because it's wrapping up so many facts, and actually it's not only a book on impact investing, but about a real impact revolution. Can you please describe this impact revolution underway, and what are the driving forces behind it, apart from this social entrepreneurship movement that you described? But there are some profound, deep driving forces, I guess, behind this revolution.
Yeah. So Antoine, the book sort of sets out the proposition that we have a self-defeating economic system now, that capitalism served us very well for 200 and more years, took a lot of people out of poverty, and that we could cope with its environmental and social consequences when their scale was reduced. But today, it's become a self-defeating system, in the sense that companies, in their search for profit, create huge damage to the environment and to society. And then our governments tax us all in order to try to remedy them. And we're digging a deeper and deeper hole for ourselves, as we can see. We see inequality creating problems everywhere, France being a prime example of it, recently in the United States, in Chile, in the Lebanon. It's erupting into violent protest. And at the same time, we see environmental damage that threatens the viability of our planet. And what the book says basically is, you know, our economic system is not distributing outcomes in a fair way. When people feel that they are being unjustly treated economically, and that the governments, democratic governments in countries like the UK, France, the US, and elsewhere, are not doing anything to redress this injustice, then they rebel against capitalism and against democracy. The fundamental problem of our economic system is that the search for profit today no longer provides the widespread prosperity and the solutions to our social challenges that we've all come to expect of it. And the book says basically, we can now measure the impact of companies. We can measure the product impact, the employment impact, the operational impact on people and on the environment. We can monetize it. We can reflect it through financial accounts. And we, in this case, is a Harvard Business School effort, which I chair, the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative, which will publish soon the accounts of 2,500 companies weighted for their environmental impact, and next year add to that employment and product impact. So we can now measure impact, and we should bring impact to the center of our consciousness and of our economic system, alongside profit. Now, why do I call it a revolution? Because I view it as overthrowing the tyranny of profit and putting impact by its side to keep it in check. But we are not giving up the power of markets, of entrepreneurship, and of capital to improve lives or the environment. We are simply channeling its efforts in the direction of improving lives and making money at the same time, which, as the book points out, leads to superior financial returns, not inferior ones, not this notion that it's somehow philanthropic and giving money away and therefore you make lower returns. The book has the proposition that there are many reasons why you should be able to deliver better financial returns by optimizing risk-return impact than by optimizing just risk and return.
And your book is being released in the most strange times, right? Just after this COVID-19 outbreak and crisis. Do you think these particular times, this epidemic and the context it created, generated, can catalyze and help this revolution to impact?
I do, Antoine. I think we are at a historic crossroad similar to 1929. In 1929, after the great crash, people sat up and said, have we really been investing in companies without measuring their profit properly? Because, as you know, at that time, every company picked its own accounting principles and there were no auditors. And in 1933, the US was the first to put us on the road to generally accepted accounting principles and auditing. Today, we have to sit up and say, with $30 trillion going to ESG investing, which is about a third of professionally managed assets, are we really investing in companies and looking only at the profit they make without worrying about the damage they're creating to people and the environment? We have to start measuring impact in a similar way that we measure profit, and governments should mandate, if they want to emerge from this crisis with the minimum damage, that companies 2 years from now must start to publish impact-weighted financial accounts that reflect both their financial and their impact performance.
Do you already have good signs from governments and regulators that they could move this way in the current context?
It's a new idea, and it is only just with the publication of my book getting exposure for the first time. But there are many powerful reasons why governments should seize the idea and implement it. The first is that we're going to see very high levels of sustained unemployment after the end of the epidemic. Companies, big and small, have got used to operating on a slimmed down basis, and they will not take back all of the workers that they laid off. I hear eminent economists saying that the figure may be as high as 40%. The stimulus packages that governments are putting in place, which focus in the main on the biggest financial institutions and companies, are going to leave the most vulnerable, as always after a crisis, hit the hardest. And inequality will increase even further. So we're likely to see violent eruption of frustration because of inequality after the crisis. At the same time, our governments are going to emerge heavily laden with debt, more heavily than perhaps ever before, and are going to have very constrained budgets. So the only way that they can attract the capital that they need in order to help with social and environmental issues is through the investment market. And that capital has to work through companies that it funds to achieve not just profit, but bringing solutions to our biggest challenges. So will every government seize the opportunity now? No. In 1933, the US was ahead of the game in seizing it. Perhaps this time Europe will be ahead of the game in seizing it. But I believe some governments will seize it out of necessity rather than choice.
Governments are probably not the only one to seize this revolution, and you made a very compelling point in your book, mentioning the survival of the most impactful. You're drawing a very interesting parallel between this impact revolution and what was the digital revolution, in the late 1990s, when startups born in, garages grew into now probably the most dominant businesses in history. Do you expect such tectonic shifts with the impact revolutions? Will impact native businesses emerge and lead the way? Or will traditional businesses, corporations, asset managers be able to adapt to this new paradigm?
So, Antoine, I like to think that technology created the water on which every ship has to sail today. There isn't a business model that has not been affected by the arrival of technology. I think impact will do the same. It'll be another layer of water on top of technology on which every ship will have to sail. The reason is that consumers and employees are demanding more of companies than just making money. Many don't want to buy the products of companies whose values they don't espouse. and many don't want to work for companies, again, with values they don't share. Investors today, as the $30 trillion of ESG and the nearly trillion now, $715 billion of impact investment, defining it as investment that, like ESG, has the intention to create impact, but unlike ESG, measures the impact created in a dependable way. Those are signals that the values are changing. And the investors became aware of changing consumer preferences and talent preferences, and they've made companies aware of the same thing. So what I believe is going to happen is that we will get to impact-weighted accounts, and these impact-weighted accounts will be the way for investors like 1929 to know what they're investing in, what the performance of a company is, both in terms of its profit and in terms of its impact. And so it becomes very important now for governments to play an enabling role in achieving this.
In your book, you're drawing kind of a three-stage process to building a genuine impact capitalism. And impact investing, probably because you're a financier yourself and made all your career in investing, but impact investing is really the first stage and the essential stage in this process. And there may be perhaps a preliminary question to ask. How do you define impact investing? What is an impact investor?
So it's not surprising that these changes in our economic system, which have already started, are expressing themselves in investment, which is the lifeblood of our economies. The types of investment that impact investment is, includes are businesses that have measurable impact objectives. If you can't measure something, then you can't really manage it. And we are seeing a phenomenon now of impact washing, where many companies are praising the good things that they do without talking of the damaging things that they do. And the net balance between the two can be negative. Let me give you one example. If you take a company in fossil fuels, take ExxonMobil. I'm not in favor of investing in fossil fuel companies. I'm against it. But if you measure the negative impact created by ExxonMobil on the environment on an annual basis, it comes to $42 billion. Now, if you compare it with Shell creates just over 20 billion. And if you compare it with BP creates just over 10 or 12 billion. These are figures we should all know. And if you look at employment, if you take a company like Intel, the wage bill for US employees of Intel is $7 billion a year, about, okay? That looks like a fantastic social contribution on the part of Intel. But if you deduct from that the difference between the ethnic representation, the diversity that exists around Intel's facilities and the employment of Intel and the uneven distribution of opportunity within Intel, then you end up with only $2.5 billion of positive employment impact. And impact is one of the leaders in terms of its efforts to encourage diversity. Now, do we not need to know these figures? Do we not need to make them public together with companies' profits so that we create a race to the top?
And so releasing, some data about the impact, positive and negative, that a business can have and that you can have as an investor is one thing. Having also a purpose, a mission is another thing. Do you see the investment community both measuring impact, but also taking a mission and a new position in the economy and society?
I think everyone who is involved in the investment world on this webinar, whether they work for financial institutions or manage family assets or their own personal assets, will agree that there is a major trend now to look at environmental, social, and governance aspects of companies that previously we completely ignored. I explained why this is happening. It's because of changes in consumer values and employment values and so on. But in a way, these values are changing because it's obvious that our ways cannot continue. We cannot continue to create inequality and social damage to the cohesion of our societies and environmental damage to our planet the way that we are doing. And so if you're running a private equity fund or a venture capital fund, as I used to do, in your conversations with LPs today, they're asking you about impact. And the issue that you face as a private equity firm or as a public stocks manager or a bond manager is when your clients ask you these questions, you have to have a satisfactory answer, and you have to have a strategy that keeps you on the right side of their asset allocation. If we're going to see increasing asset allocations in the direction of impact investment with measurable impact through impact-weighted accounts and so on, private equity and venture firms are going to have to ask themselves, do I launch a private equity fund that is an impact fund and I measure the impact, or do I shift the whole of my firm to measuring impact? There is no other way. And you've heard from the BlackRocks and others of this world that the sense of mission that their clients have is being reflected now in their own sense of mission. So the answer to your question is things change. Things have changed before in the investment world, and they're changing again. When I started off at the age of 26 in the early 70s to build what became Apax, the average portfolio held two securities: the bonds of the country and the stocks of that country are quoted on its exchange. Risk thinking came in the early 50s and made its way. And the idea of risk-adjusted returns and diversification was just beginning when I started out. Diversification opened the door to venture capital and private equity and hedge funds. It also opened the door to investment in emerging markets and funding globalization. It changed the face of every portfolio in the world, so that almost every portfolio today is a multi-asset class portfolio. There are very few portfolios that only invest in their national bonds and their national stocks, if any. Okay? Impact is going to do the same thing. Impact thinking is going to lead to a change in investment portfolios. You're already seeing portfolios moving away from fossil fuels, and you will see them moving away, and some have moved away from tobacco and from gambling and from alcohol and, and so on. And you will begin to see portfolios shift in the direction of companies that can do well because of impact. Companies that are able to boost their profits because of impact. And the reason they're going to deliver better returns, the reason they will sit in a better place on the efficient frontier of investment is that when you bring impact into the investment equation, you reduce the risk of consumers, talent, and investors deserting you and of governments regulating and taxing you, but you also open the door to new sets of investment opportunities that are often huge.
What I find really disruptive in your views is that you don't see impact investing as a narrow asset class, right? You see it as a brand new paradigm that ultimately should take over the complete asset management industry somehow.
Yeah.
And right now, out of the, as you mentioned, there are about 30 trillion of assets managed with an ESG ethos out of the more than 200 trillions of assets under management. But there are only something like, there are only a few billions of pure impact investment under management, something like 500 billions of assets under management, I read recently. What are the limitations right now? Where do you see, why is impact investing only to this scale? You must start with something, obviously, but where are the limits and how to raise them?
So the latest figures from the GIN published just last week show that impact investment is at $715 billion versus $500 billion, as you saw the year before. So it's growing very fast. When I started thinking about this, and in my book, The Second Bounce of the Ball, which came out in 2007 and dealt with entrepreneurship, I saw then impact investment as an asset class. With the development of social impact bonds and so on, we did create a new asset class. If you can make an uncorrelated return of 5 to 10% net by investing in a social impact bond fund, where the return depends on how many kids you got to complete their education, how many homeless people you took off the street, how many prisoners went into jobs instead of jail, that is a new asset category, undoubtedly. But I began to realize later that it was risk-return impact throughout the whole economy, in consumption, in employment, in investment, within companies as they make investment decisions. And so it shifted from looking like an asset class to becoming really a mega trend throughout the whole of the investment world. And if we bring now impact measurement to $30 trillion of equities and of bonds and and impact investment, private investment of one kind or another, it's no longer an asset class. It is across, as I was saying, like technology has become an industry, it's across all investment areas, just as risk spread across all our investment categories.
And there is also a very important trend in impact entrepreneurs and impact entrepreneurship. You're mentioning many good examples of them in emerging countries, but also in our Western economies as well. You did a career as a venture capitalist, backing, the new businesses to grow. Do you think there will be, or there are already perhaps, some of these large impact businesses to the scale of the Google and Facebook today?
Right. So first, let me just say that I'm a firm believer that the definition of an impact unicorn will be different from a normal unicorn. So it'll be a company or a venture worth $1 billion and touching the lives of 1 billion people. Then let me say Tesla is probably the first iconic example of an impact business, which had a measurable objective, which was to reduce carbon emissions from cars, and which, because of its superior business model, has shifted the whole of the automobile industry away from the combustion engine to hybrids and electric cars. And you can't argue that investing in Tesla was a bad investment. It's worth more than General Motors today. And I want to just give an example of how impact creates new markets and provides the opportunity for higher growth and profitability. As you mentioned, I cover half a dozen companies or so, entrepreneurial companies, and one of them is an Israeli company called Orkan. I think it is iconic in its own way. It was set up by the entrepreneurs who created and sold Mobileye to Intel for $15 billion, a startup that became worth $15 billion in 17 years or so. And one of the two entrepreneurs had an aunt who was going blind, and she asked him to help her. And 6 years ago, he used the technology, the deep AI technology that had been developed at Mobileye as a basis for creating a pair of spectacles to help the blind. And these spectacles have a memory stick hanging off the side, and they whisper into the ear of the holder or the wearer, should I say, the page of the book they're holding, or the newspaper they're holding, or the banknote in their hand. Okay? Now, there are 35 million blind people in the world and 250 million visually impaired people. So you would say this is a 300 million person market. It's a big market. The ventures raised $100 million of venture capital. And the last round was at $600 million. So Antoine, I'm sure you would agree this is a fantastic example of an impact venture. But if you are an impact entrepreneur, you would ask yourself the question, how can my impact be the greatest? How can I use my technology to help the greatest number of people? And the answer that comes back is a revealing one. What if you gave these spectacles to the 800 million illiterate adults in the world? What would that do for their lives, and what would that do for their economies and even for the global economy, to bring 800 million people from being illiterate to being able to read? So the scope in terms of scale is massive. And if you know how to think about impact, you not only reduce the risk of your venture, you increase its potential vastly in some cases.
Last week, the Danone board decided as well to shift Danone to a purpose-driven business, to adopt a mission. Is it also a move that you're witnessing and that you think is important for the corporate community?
So, as you know from reading the book, I cover half a dozen big companies as well, and Danone is the first. And Emmanuel Faber of Danone is completely exceptional in understanding deeply these changes in the world and being able to implement a new business model. And I think his company will be more successful as a result. Paul Polman of Unilever is a similarly enlightened business leader. And I also cover other big companies like IKEA and Adidas and Chobani that try to deliver impact through one aspect of their operations in a methodical way. In the case of Adidas, it's a product impact on the environment. In the case of Chobani, it's the employment of immigrants. In the case of IKEA, it's the total operations environmental damage that they try to reduce. But most businesses aren't on this wavelength at all. For them, this is an additional headache. The last thing they want is for governments to mandate it, just as in the 30s, there were representations to Congress that if we brought in standardized financial accounting and auditors, it would be the end of American capitalism. And so, like everything in life, you have some big businesses that will lead and some businesses that will follow and some that will follow very late and very reluctantly and do very badly as a result of it. But what we have seen is public expression by representatives of big business, the Big Business Roundtable in the United States, for instance, which is chaired by Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, come out and say our society requires now that business responds to the needs of all stakeholders, not just shareholders. And so the Milton Friedman doctrine that came in 50 years ago, that the purpose of business is just business, and companies should only be concerned about making a profit and not worry about anything else, is giving way now to the notion that risk-return impact has to drive businesses. And so technology was not adopted with open arms by every business, and nor will impact. But at the end of the day, technology and impact will win, and every business will have to integrate them.
And then as population or other market players that are very important in the investment world, you mentioned these shareholders, right, in the corporate world. Institutional investors, pension plans, insurance companies, endowments, how prepared are they, how keen are they to embrace this impact revolution?
I think institutional investors now, pension funds, insurance companies, endowments like the Ford Foundation, pension funds like PGGM in the Netherlands, insurance companies like Zurich and Aviva and L&G in the UK are on this wavelength. Asset managers like BlackRock and Wellington and LGT in the UK, Schroders, are even further ahead. So the investment community is beginning to understand this, but it lacks the tools to be able to do the job. You couldn't really make great investment decisions in the early 30s because you couldn't compare the performance of companies reliably. And today you can't make good investment decisions that involve profit and impact if you don't measure the impact. So I come back to it again. The watershed between risk return as a paradigm and risk return impact as the new paradigm is going to be impact weighted financial accounts. And we should emerge, just as we emerged from 1929, with this major step forward, the next step, if you like, after Adam Smith, the invisible heart of markets coming in to guide their invisible hand.
Let's move now to who we all are. We are all market participants, being, working for an institutional investor, a fund manager, but we are all citizens, consumers, savers. At the end of you write, 10 years ago, we did not know what to do to improve our economic system. Now the pieces are in place. And the last sentence in your book is also giving the reader a real mission. There has never been a greater need or better times than right now. So what do you expect from all of us, the audience, listening to you right now? How can we play our part in this?
So I think each of us can play our role in this impact revolution. We can play our role as a consumer, buying the products of companies that do the right thing. We can play our role as an employee, working for companies that do the right thing. We can play our role as an investor, investing in companies that do the right thing. We can play our role as a philanthropist, using the new tools of impact investment to maximize the improvement that we achieve in people's lives and in improving the planet. And as governments, we can make ourselves more efficient by using outcomes-based approaches, by attracting investment from the capital markets to take on the risk of experimentation and pay only when the results have been delivered. Every single one of us has a role to play in this revolution.
Terrific. Thank you, Sir Ronald. We can now take perhaps a few minutes to take the questions of the audience. Let me remind you all that we have a Q&A tool in our system, and I got 3 questions, and then maybe some others showing up in the meantime. I will read it through. It's a rather long one, Ronald.
Okay.
As a fairly nascent asset class, impact investment has only really experienced a protracted bull run, and yet, according to the gene, 2/3 of investors in impact funds now expect market rate returns. Can we be sure it will deliver? So it's a question about the returns, I guess.
Yeah. We can be sure that there is the basis for outperforming if you invest on the basis of risk return impact than if you invest on the basis of risk return. Some companies will do a better job of it than others, but the future is going to be to those that can do both. And there will be companies like Tesla that demonstrate over and over again that you can do both. We had the same type of question about technology companies, 40 years ago. Is technology really going to deliver profits? Can companies really absorb technology and improve their ability to make money? And the answer is, when you find a powerful tool, some people learn to use it very well and they benefit from it. The key is to pick the right management that understands that risk return impact is the future and that knows how to apply that to the strategy of their company. And if you can measure dependably the impact from a product or from employment, from operations of companies, and look at their profit, and you can begin to look at PE ratios on the basis of impact-weighted earnings per share, and you can begin to create correlations between companies that deliver more impact, attract more talent, more loyal consumers, and their future growth and profit, then it'll change the world.
We have another question from Gilles, sorry. It tackles something that was very important in our conversation, impact measurement. And the question is, what are the major tools to measure impact investment goals, performance, and are there any automatic tools? And another question that I may add on top of it, is it or will it be standardized? Do you expect it to be a standardized, measurement, or do you expect everyone to measure its, relative impact, and at the end, people to make their choice?
So the first part of the question, the tools are going to be impact-weighted financial accounts. Companies will publish 2 sets of accounts, at least initially, for several years. They're traditional financial accounts and impact-weighted accounts. You will get these accounts on Bloomberg terminals, where today you find general information and some specific information, but seldom on a comparable basis across companies. You have measurement systems that involve rating companies, and it makes it very difficult to look at their rating in one area, the environmental area, versus their rating in the employment area, to look through their activities and to come to a net figure. We need to measure And technology enables us today to measure the environmental and the social consequences. Like you can measure CO2 emissions, we can value CO2 emissions. Companies are making a lot of information available, but we should have accurate information from companies, just as we do for their financial accounts.
Another question from Amy for you, Sir Cohen. Has the green agenda overly dominated impact investment in the past year? Is that now likely to change, probably because of the social context we are living?
Yeah, I think we are going to see. You just have to look at what happened in the United States, sadly, recently. We're all going to see expressions of frustration from inequality. It happens in one place, but it's seen by all of us across the world. That raises questions about diversity, diversity in employment, diversity in education, and so on. So I do think that we are going to rebalance a bit the impact conversation between both environmental and social considerations. And of course, impact-weighted accounts unite both. They don't distinguish, they don't measure just one dimension. They measure all dimensions. The difference between the two efforts is that the environmental effort, which started 40 years ago, started from the top, trying to influence government. The social effort started from the bottom, inventing social impact bonds, development impact bonds, outcomes funds, impact capital wholesalers, impact-weighted financial accounts, and so on. And if the two come together, they're going to be so much more powerful now. And so for those of you who are involved in the green movement, but not in the social movement and the other way around, impact unites us all. And we should all be pushing governments for impact-weighted accounts that measure both the environmental and the social impacts of companies. And that will be the answer to measuring the impact of portfolios. You can't measure the impact of a portfolio if you can't measure the impact of of the companies in it. Just as just as with profit, if you didn't have companies below that enabled you to analyze the financial performance, then the return of the portfolio would not be that meaningful.
We have also a question that was asked anonymously, perhaps for some reasons, Ronald. What would be your advice for those portfolio company leadership teams who are struggling to get their shareholders to move beyond ESG compliance and into real investment in ESG developments? How do you get them to recognize the payback in terms of planet, people, and profit, not just traditional ROI?
I think the problem is that there is a preconceived notion today, which is that if you're going to be involved in doing good, you're going to do less well. And so a lot of investors are very wary of focusing on anything other than profit. So the way to get across that is first to educate people. And I wrote the book for the impact movement. The book is not about me. Exactly for that purpose. If they read the book and if they get the sense that the world is going in this direction and that you can make good returns, ESG investments, according to BlackRock, have outperformed other investments so far this year. If they begin to educate themselves in it, then I think that's the way to get them to engage in the conversation. And then the next bit is to say to them, make a 10% allocation to ESG and impact investment initially. Give responsibility to a different CIO if the existing CIO doesn't believe in it. And let's compare the returns over time. See who does better.
There's also another solution that you mentioned several times in your book is move to another company that is more driven, right?
That is the ultimate solution.
Thank you a lot, Sir Cohen. I may want to raise a last question, and thank you to all of you who took part to this webinar and raised the question. So we have some news. Sir Ronald Cohen will be the opening speaker of IPEM 21 in February, and it is really an honor, Ronnie, to have you early in 21 in Cannes. And by the time, in the meantime, before February 21, what are your greatest expectations regarding this impact revolution? What kind of news or positive evolutions would you expect?
I would expect that we will see an increasing number of investors creating allocations after COVID-19. I think allocations to ESG and impact investment. I think COVID has shaken a lot of our assumptions about our system. And I think a lot of investors are beginning to realize now, if you look at the private equity industry, for instance, that there are top firms moving in this direction. The TPG has raised several $billion, Bain Capital, Partners Group in Europe, Blackstone, and so on. There are many top quality investment firms that are going in this direction. And you see BlackRock and others doing the same for public securities. So my hope would be that we might see investors now begin to create allocations, as the Ford Foundation did, $1 billion out of a $14 billion portfolio, and begin to advertise it. Regulations have changed to allow this. It wasn't completely forbidden, but investors could interpret it as a disincentive to look at non-financial considerations when making investment decisions. The regulations changed in the United States to accommodate this broader interpretation of what a successful return is. And in the UK too, there have been Law Commission reports about it. But if governments came out now and passed the legislation to say that this that this is acceptable, it would certainly help. I don't think we're going to get every government jumping up and signing up to impact-weighted financial accounts, but I hope that with the publication of the accounts of more than 2,500 companies weighted for their environmental impact quite soon, that all of you and many others outside this webinar will begin to push for impact-weighted accounts, so that by the time we meet in Cannes in February, it is perhaps a real subject of conversation.
Thank you very much, Sir Cohen. Sorry for all the questions we could not take. And let me remind all of you about the book, Impact, to be released this week. For those who need some information, you can get them on your website. Ronald, you may have, the address is sirronaldcohen.com, I think.
.org.
.org, sorry. .org.
But it's available on Amazon, and if you read it, do let me know your reaction to it and any comments or suggestions that you have.
Thank you, Ronnie, for this very inspiring conversation.
Great pleasure, Antoine. Thank you.
Take care.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye.